Hi everyone, my name is Catherine Claypool, and this is my presentation for Communications 340 on disciplinary issues and the possible strategies that you can use to counteract those issues. I chose this issue because it seems as though there have been constant questions about disciplinary practices in the family unit. There has been constant debate about how or what the best disciplinary strategies are for parents to practice or to use in the family unit. Conflicting parenting styles seem to be a huge part of this. I also wanted to do this topic because of my own personal experience, because my parents had very different conflicting parenting styles, and I wanted to find out more research of the topic of discipline in general, and I wanted to find out possible strategies in dealing with discipline since I in the future would like to have my own children. Next, I would like to talk about what is the issue. The issue I see in this topic is how should parents discipline their children, which is the main question I hope to answer. Research from psychologists have discussed different parenting styles and which one of these parenting styles produces the best outcome for children, which I will later discuss in my presentation. I will also discuss strategies that parents can use to help discipline their children, as well as provide information on what experts have to say about disciplinary practices that have been used or are currently being used. I also plan to discuss what will happen if, or what possible consequences are for not using the best disciplinary practices. I still want to know why parents should discipline their children, or how, not why, based on their values or society's values or their own personal experiences. I believe all factor into that, which is part of what the issue is. I have done some previous research on this topic, and the one thing that caught my attention was that disciplinary practices that families use seem to be different based on each situation of family experiences, and I want to figure out how true that may be. This is also why I felt this to be an important topic for further examination. Overall, this issue is important in terms of communication within the family, because without effective parenting disciplinary tools, you can have ineffective communication in your family, which is part of why I want to also talk about what strategies might be used, because there has been high conflict in that as well. Now I turn to current disciplinary issues. The main issue that I found in terms of discipline that kept coming up over and over again was spanking, whether parents should or should not spank their children, and the possible consequences for doing so. Most of the research that I have found discourages spanking, which is the issue I'm choosing to focus on in my presentation. According to the Center for Parenting Education, spanking can cause harm to both the parent and the child. While stopping the behavior temporarily, it does not teach any alternative behaviors, and it interferes with the development of trust and sense of security between the parent and the child, effective communication between the parent and the child, and the development of internal controls or self-discipline. It interferes with those processes. And it may also cause resentment and harm in the parent-child relationship. And this is something I found that was very consistent with the research that I discovered on spanking. Another resource that I found was a study done by the Interdisciplinary Journal of Applied Family Studies. And this was a study in a journal of the article, which was called Forms of Spanking and Children's External Behaviors, which means outward behaviors that we can see in children The idea behind this study, what they wanted to figure out, was that if increased spanking at the ages of 6, 7, and 8 was the result of externalized or outward behavior among these groups of children. The result of the study was that when children of these ages were spanked on a regular basis, at least once a week or more with a parent hand, had higher levels of mother-reported externalizing behaviors, not positive behaviors, at these ages, compared to children who experience more mild to no spanking at all, with little to no externalized behavior in those groups. When I say those groups, and children that weren't spanked. Overall, in my conclusions from this research, which I did from many other sources as well, but cannot fit that all into this presentation, unfortunately. But from that research, if and when spanking is used, I have found that it should be used discretionally. And as previously stated, I did many research on other area resources, and they all came to the central conclusion that spanking should be used discretionally among parents. And here are some alternatives to spanking. According to the Center for Parenting Education, some alternatives to spanking are as follows. Rewarding and encouraging positive behavior, catching that your children did something correctly, will hopefully cause repetition. Also, next would be adjusting expectations. If frequent frustration is occurring, consider if you are expecting too much from your child, and this might help reevaluate the situation. And third is letting go of an issue. If an issue is of less importance and is harming the parent-child relationship, choose to let it go, or what they say is to pick your battles. And then using consequences and taking away privileges, which I feel this one can not only be applied in parent-child relationship, but even more so in daycare settings or in school settings. And the next would be taking a break so that your child and yourself can calm down, and the issue can always be revisited later when you both have had time to discuss and think, well, to just let it fester for a little bit and then come back to it later when you both might be calmer. And then number 6 is discussing with your children ways to deal with the problem. Now realize that last one can only happen at certain ages because sometimes kids might be too young to discuss the problem. But with my personal experience, I've worked in a daycare for almost 2 years now, and I've worked with 2.5 to 4-year-olds, and I know that 2.5 to 4-year-olds can still understand that if they're hitting a child or if they're doing something wrong. I know at that point, from my experience, that they can understand what they're doing is wrong, and we can talk about ways to be nicer to their friends. So it is possible to have those discussions with children at younger ages as well as older ages as well. I didn't want anyone thinking that kids at a younger age can't understand, because I know that they can from my own personal experience in working with young children. Next, I will talk about the overview of parenting styles. First, there is authoritarian parenting. Authoritarian parents communicate high responsiveness and low demandingness. This means that authoritarian parents attempt too much to shape and control and evaluate a child's behavior with a very absolute code of conduct, such as religion or the law. This parent, which equals this parent, is more concerned with control, not warmth and nurturing of the child. Next, there is authoritative parenting. This parent is concerned with high demandingness, but also high responsiveness. This parent encourages give and take with the child, which means giving reasoning behind each rule that a parent sets for the child. And this parent also provides the child with an accepting environment, but at the same time providing a structured environment, which psychologists in our textbook refer to this as adequate balance. Next, there is a third style called permissive parenting. This parent is on the track of high responsiveness, which is warmth, which is great. However, there is also low demandingness or control with this parenting style. This parent allows the child to regulate his or her own behaviors, avoiding extrinsic motivators such as rewards and externally imposed rules and structure. Now while that may not sound that bad, however, it leads parents of this style to use reason and manipulation to affect a child's behavior, and we can see problems with that. And this parent with this permissive style also lacks any to little expectations for their child, which I always took as meaning as parents not expecting much of their children. And possible consequences for this include children lacking self-control and self-reliance in their preschool years and continuing years, higher school-related conflict due to low expectations at home, poor academic adjustment, and lower self-esteem. There is also a fourth parenting style that I did not include on these slides, but that's called uninvolved parenting style, which includes complete and utter neglect of the child. And in this parenting style, including the uninvolved, I will address the possible consequences of that later when I talk about when Child Protective Services and law enforcement need to get involved. Now, keeping the previously discussed parenting styles in mind, I will now illustrate a real life scenario in my own life. My mother was an authoritative parent, which, as we previously discussed, is high demandingness and high responsiveness. And my father was an authoritarian parent, which, as previously discussed, is low demandingness and high responsiveness. So while my parents were both highly responsive, one parent had clear expectations of me, the other did not. In these differing parenting styles, I felt equaled family conflict. And here is my scenario. I was called into the principal's office in 4th grade because I punched a girl for making fun of my best friend. My father didn't really expect much from me and said that it was not okay what I did, regardless of the reason. It did not want to hear anything I had to say, and therefore went straight to the punishment wouldn't even listen to me at all. Didn't want to hear it, didn't have any expectations, didn't try to find anything out about it. Just clear, right, wrong, no questions asked. My mother, on the other hand, had clear expectations of me and wanted to know why I did what I did, and she carefully listened to me, and we came up with an appropriate punishment together, with a common understanding and clear expectations on what she expected of me if presented with a similar situation again. Therefore, in this situation, with my mother, there was a lot of give and take. However, the conversation with my mother did not occur till about 2 weeks later, in which my punishment was recalculated because my father decided not to tell my mother about what had happened that day at school. And this led me to be very confused. Now, why, you might ask? Because I felt this led to a lot of my family's communication challenges. My parents did not communicate with each other well when these kinds of situations came up, and this created a lot of miscommunication in our family, and ultimately I felt it led to one of the things that led to my parents eventually getting their divorce. Now, you might be wondering how a situation like this could potentially cause a separation, which later turned into a divorce, but this kind of situation where my father didn't communicate with my mother, or in some cases vice versa, it happened all the time. They stopped communicating with each other. My father mostly just stopped caring and just checked out of the family for a while. And this is what I felt led to one of the situations of many, and other similar ones like that, involving more serious things. Not that punching someone's not serious, but other situations led to more serious things, involving more serious things, with lack of communication between my parents. And this is a problem because, well, if you don't communicate with each other about what's going on in your children's lives, it can lead to situations like this where one parent doesn't find out about what happened until a week or maybe even 2 weeks later. And that can cause a lot of strife and conflict. This is what I feel leads to was the beginning of my family's conflict, but certainly not the end of it. And this is what one of the situations I feel that illustrates those interactional challenges and communication challenges. Next, I will talk about how the community deals with ineffective parenting strategies. First, talking about CPS, which is Child Protective Services. And this slide will talk about what to do, what Child Protective Services does, and a parent is not being effective. In order to do that, I feel I have to discuss the purpose of Child Protective Services, which is to assess the safety of children and intervene to protect children from harm, strengthen the ability of families to protect their children, provide either reunification, which means helping the family will reunite, helping them do this, or providing an alternative, safer family for the child. Next, there are certain stages, 7 stages that the CPS goes through, which further outlines their role in the process and how they deal with cases of child abuse and neglect. First of the steps is intake, which is evaluation of the case. And this is more in-depth than law enforcement, a little more in-depth, which I'll talk about in the next slide. Then there's initial assessment or intervention of the case, determining exactly what went on in a more in-depth manner. And there's assessment of the family as a whole, and determining if the child can return to the family. Then there's family progress, which means they go back and see how the family is doing. And then they also plan the case of the family, and they offer service provision and case closure. So in a nutshell, CPS, Child Protective Services, evaluates the child, but also evaluates the family to see what went on and if maltreatment took place, which is the assessment process. And if this happens, what CPS will do is find an alternative family for the child if necessary, or hopefully rehabilitate the child and the family so that the child can stay in their own family. Next, I will talk about the role of law enforcement in cases of neglect and abuse, which is similar but not exactly the same as what CPS does, but there's a lot of similarities here because they work together a lot of the times. And so first, the law enforcement must determine a case of neglect abuse if it has occurred, and if it has, to then determine who is responsible and to decide what actions need to be taken to protect the child. With this, keeping this in mind, law enforcement plays 6 vital roles in the cases of neglect and abuse. And the first role is prevention and advocacy, which this is to raise the community awareness on child neglect and abuse, which is very important, I feel, because a lot of families don't, or a lot of the community does not realize how often this happens, and it's very cleverly hidden in some cases. And second, the law enforcement needs to report, and then 16% of reports to CPS, because law enforcement reports to CPS, and 16% of those reports come from law enforcement. And the third is support to Child Protective Services. And this is how they work together, because law enforcement often will accompany Child Protective Service workers on case calls, because Child Protective Services, they don't carry weapons, they don't have weapons training to deal with if a person becomes violent, if child removal is necessary. So law enforcement goes along with CPS and helps them in those situations when necessary. Then the fourth role law enforcement has is the immediate response, which this just means that sometimes law enforcement can react faster than CPS in some situations. And this just means just getting to the situation faster in case of an emergency. And then law enforcement also plays an investigative role, which is determining exactly what happened, so then they can help CPS and report it to them when necessary. And then the sixth is victim support, which is supporting the child as the case goes to court, maybe sitting with them in the courtroom, or in some cases being an advocate for the child. And advocacy is related in step 1, but it also is involved in step 6 as well. Next, I would like to talk about effective discipline. So first, what works? The main research I found as far as what works is responding according to a child's temperament. An example of this would be an active child might need a more hands-on approach, such as physical removal from a situation or a timeout. Whereas a child who's very sensitive and quiet, this is how I was when I was younger, would need a more quiet, reassuring approach. And this, I feel, would involve getting down at the child's level and practicing authoritative parenting. And then Scholastic Inc. gives a variety of effective discipline methods based on different situations a parent might encounter. When I say based on different situations, in which, depending on what the child did or did not do, in some cases, you could use these suggestions, in which these suggestions are physical intervention, and this might reflect back more to the active child, or with any child, but in particular with the active child, particularly when the child's safety is at risk. Physical intervention is sometimes what is necessary. Then there's timeouts, that thing where you'd sit in a chair and give a child time to think about what they did and why they did it, and then that also gives the parent time to cool down and collect their thoughts as well. And then the third would be taking away toys. And this usually occurs when a child is hitting a kid with someone else with a toy or not sharing the toy, and that's when this method is often used. And I would like to add, though, that all these methods should be based on the unwanted behaviors and not the child's initial character. The punishment should be focused on the behavior that the child did, not the child itself, which means basically not to start attacking the child's personality by saying things like, you shouldn't do this, or you're so, that starts attacking the child. In other words, your disciplinary practice should be focused on the child's behavior. And next, I would like to talk about ineffective discipline. In other words, what doesn't work and what parents do wrong. The main argument I found was this question: are parents too strict in their discipline, or are they not strict enough? But according to Dr. Laura Markham, there are 7 reasons why strict parenting does not work. And those reasons are that strict parenting deprives kids of the opportunity to internalize self-discipline and responsibility. In other words, this prevents them from solving a situation themselves and determining what they did wrong with very strict parenting, like not letting them figure things out for themselves. And then the second ineffective thing is why strict parenting doesn't work is authoritarian parenting, which I've already discussed in previous slides, but that is limits without discipline. And to review again, it's basically a high demand, strict rules, but without empathy or explanation for those rules. And third is that kids raised with punitive discipline tend to have a tendency towards anger and depression in later years or in current years, depending on the age of your child. Fourth reason is that kids raised with strict discipline learn that power is always right, so that the person with more power controls the situation, and that the more power you have, the better you are. And this is why research that I found also discredits spanking, because that's a form of power. And then fifth would be because kids raised strictly on do right when the parent is there, they tend to get into more trouble. And also, coming back to authoritarian parenting again, it undermines the parent-child relationship. Now, the question that I wanted to find in this project is that if there is a best approach. And the answer I would say is, from my research, I found that authoritative parenting, which if you recall from previous slides, is high demand and high responsiveness, which means high expectations but with high empathy and support for the child. And this I feel is the best approach because it incorporates getting down the child's level and listening to what they did wrong, but also setting clear expectations with them as in reference to what is right from what is wrong. In other words, a parenting style allows a child to go off on their own, but yet have that secure parental base to come back to whenever they do something wrong or something wrong is done to them. So in answer to the question, I feel authoritative parenting is the best approach, but I do realize that it's not that simple and that there are things in families that intervene with that approach. Before ending my presentation, now I'd like to talk about some strategies or tips in practicing effective discipline. AAP.org gives a variety of tips and strategies, which AAP means American Academy of Pediatrics. They give tips and strategies for parents in terms of what parents can do and things to keep in mind about your child, which will help the effective discipline process. Some of these suggestions include responses to misbehavior must be developmentally appropriate to be effective. Such, for example, distraction and diversion work best for infants and toddlers, which this can involve changing the activity or the environment. Second, giving immediate praise for behaviors that you're trying to reinforce, such as telling them good job or thank you for using your words or way to use your words or whatever, dependent on whatever the behavior may be that you want them to keep continuing. And then ignoring behavior such as tantrum or whining can be very effective because if you give it a lot of attention, it'll condone the behavior because it's an attention-seeking behavior, tantrums. 4 tips that they give is building responsibility by offering your child choices. This allows them to choose potential consequences, like saying, if you keep hitting this child, you're going to lose this choice to play. And then a 5th thing is that when children try out aggressive behaviors to get their way, a simple response such as no hitting can be very effective. If not, this is where a previous tactic such as timeouts or removing the child from the situation can be effective. The 6th thing is helping children express their feelings with words rather than physical aggression such as hitting. And it sounds like it might be simple, but it's really easier said than done. Now, with all the research I found, it's been hard trying to narrow it down into 8 to 12 slides because there's so much you could do. I mean, I probably could have done 4 slides just on tips and practicing effective discipline because there's so many other things that go into strategies and tips and helping parents and the best outcome for the child and all these other factors that factor into what I wanted to talk about during this presentation. And therefore, this concludes my presentation, and I hope that you found it informative and enlightening. I tried to include what I could with the guidelines and the 8 to 12 slides, which, as I mentioned, was pretty hard for me to do, but hopefully I gave you a great overview on disciplinary issues and what can happen if poor parenting is practiced, such as permissiveness or uninvolved and neglectful parenting. And hopefully I gave you good strategies and tips in practicing effective discipline. And to visit, if you would like more in-depth information that I felt I wasn't able to cover or that I didn't have time to cover, on my last slide I will include references, and then you can feel free to visit the website if you're at all interested in this subject. And thank you for watching my presentation.